What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology, and Merry Christmas video time. I want to talk about facial attractiveness ratings. Are they accurate? When you see ratings of facial attractiveness in the context of research or when people are rating your face, how far can you trust that? Well, let's look and see what the research shows. So there's two questions really that we want to look at here in this video. One of those is going to be how accurate are facial rating services, right? This is one person rating your face. It's usually going to be someone that you pay money to, and they will give you a facial rating. How they do that may vary from person to person. And the second question is how accurate are these ratings in research, right? When you read a study about facial attractiveness, how do you know that the ratings are real, right? How do you know that the ratings are correct, that they are accurately rating the attractiveness of a face? How closely do they correlate with one another? Very important, because that will tell you how well you should expect them to correlate with the population in general. So mostly we're going to be talking about the research because, as we'll see, there's no research on like paid face raters, right? But there are many things we can apply from the research to that. So moving on first, let's look at some methodology of facial ratings and some research on that. So a lot of these are going to be what is essentially opinion-based. And when I say opinion-based, what I mean by that is people are simply asked to rate a face, right? This is going to be the most common thing you see in research. They can be asked to rate a face for different traits or different features, trustworthiness, attractiveness. Is this face desirable for a long-term relationship? Is it desirable for a short-term relationship? And that sort of thing. There's many, many things. Is it an intelligent face? Do you think this person is intelligent? Many things that you can rate a face on. We're going to focus mostly on attractiveness, but that's typically going to be the methodology. The second one would be a criteria-based face rating, right? And sometimes you'll see in research in papers, it'll say like, we had some trained raters. So what does this mean when you see something that says trained raters? It'll typically be other researchers. It might be a group of students. It could be a group of people selected in a sample that are then trained to rate a face. And this will often be a criteria-based thing. And the way that that's done can vary from study to study, but they might say, rate the cheekbones, rate the jaw, and that sort of thing. They might have a code book, right, that lists specific features, specific proportions, that sort of a thing. And from that point, you derive this kind of facial rating. And I think that's what a lot of facial rating services do or try to do from what I have seen. Do they really do that? Certainly we don't know, but that's probably something that is going to be more common if you have an individual rating your face. Hopefully it's not just someone saying, oh yeah, this is what I think your face is, because, well, we'll see why that probably isn't a good thing in a minute here. So a third one, actually, that we can also mention is artificial intelligence, algorithms, right? Machine learning facial ratings. This is something that's pretty new, and it seems to work pretty well, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, They actually approximate mean human facial ratings pretty well. Here's an example of a study in the slide that I put up here. So a novel facial attractiveness evaluation system based on face shape, facial structure, features of skin. So certainly, plotting out many, many points on the face, the tone of the skin, the smoothness of the skin, all of these different things can go into the algorithm and produce a facial rating. How do you know if that's any good? Well, you can compare it to the average ratings of human beings, right? And we see a pretty high correlation there, right? Pearson's R in this paper, for example, of 0.86. So very high correlation there. You can even find these now just online for free, where you can just upload a photo and it'll rate your face. How good are those online? I don't know. But, there's many papers like this at this point on machines rating the face, basically, and they do seem to produce pretty high correlations with actual human ratings. There's some question as to if these ratings might be biased racially or something like that. At the same time, human beings are also biased toward in-group preferences, ratings of faces. They might not do that well with facial hair. For example, they seem to prefer smoother faces. But again, that's also kind of consistent with some of the research, at least, that we see on human ratings of facial attractiveness. So something to consider. Not something we're going to talk about anymore in this video, but I just wanted to mention that anyway. So, looking now at some ratings in research. What does research generally show us about facial attractiveness ratings, how accurate they are? The largest meta-analysis to date, and I should say this is actually a meta-analysis of 11 separate meta-analyses of facial ratings and how well they correlate with one another, is Lengelis and colleagues 2000. So it's old, at this point, but these correlations, their sizes, well replicated. This is something that's very consistent, but this has a lot of information, so I wanted to share this one with you guys. So, most of the studies included in this meta-analysis, which was hundreds and hundreds of studies at that point, they all use photos, and I said most use pictures of faces, right? Some use videos. Very rarely, until more recently with speed dating research becoming more popular, speed dating research being where you get your samples, you put them in a group, and they actually do a speed date, where they can talk in person and rate. So that's becoming a little bit more common now. I think it's very good methodology, but at the same time, most facial attractiveness ratings are rating a face, picture of a face, staring at the screen. Most use a Likert scale. Likert scale, what is that? Usually it's going to be 1 through 5 or 1 through 7, starting at very unattractive, neutral, attractive, very attractive. Some version of that. It's less common that you actually see a decile scale. A decile scale, what is that? Well, a rating of 1 to 10, which is kind of how we commonly think of facial ratings, right? Is rate them on a 1 to 10 is probably the most common thing you will hear, but actually most research uses a 5 or a 7-point Likert scale. Is there a benefit or a downside? There's probably benefits to both, but not a huge difference in either case. So, most people ask to rate a face. And that's going to be what most of the studies have done, included in this meta-analysis and included in the studies that we go forward and look at further in this video. So the main findings from Lengelis and colleagues here, we have looking at studies that have ratings rated within cultures, across ethnicity. Let's look first at two things, okay? We have mean reliability and pair reliability, okay? So what is that? Mean reliability is the correlation between your group, basically. How strong is that correlation between everyone rating a face, okay? Pair is the correlation between two individuals of raters, okay? So this is something to keep in mind, because it's very important going forward here, is that mean ratings are much higher than pair ratings. I'll explain why that is in a little bit. So looking now at these results, mean reliability, okay, within a culture, for example, if you're in the United States, for example, pretty high for adults, and also when adults rate the faces of children, okay? For adults, 0.9, a perfect correlation would be 1, so 0.9, very high, 0.85 for ratings of children. I put the confidence intervals on here to show you as well. These are very small confidence intervals, so if you were to replicate this, ideally with the same sample, you could do it over and over, the mean would fall somewhere in that, so it's kind of a measure of precision over time. Pair reliability, right? You take two people out of your sample and you look at how well those two people's ratings correlate, actually much lower. So for ratings of adults, 0.47, okay? Ratings of children, 0.21. So there's more disagreement between individuals than there is across the whole group. That's important because when you're actually dating, right? When you're actually interacting with people in the world, you're not interacting with the mean of, a sample of 300 people. You're interacting with one person. So understanding that facial attractiveness ratings have high variability between individuals is very, very important. And it means, in a practical sense, that someone might find your face attractive. Most people might find your face attractive, but a lot of people might not, right? Or a lot of people might not, but you still might have a good chunk of people, 10% or so, that find your face really, really attractive. High variation. And that can be kind of hidden when looking at just the mean reliability. Moving on to the next slide here. So cross-culturally, we actually see just mean reliabilities in this meta-analysis on those, but a little bit higher here, 0.94 for cross-cultural ratings of adults. Very surprising. So this is one of the papers that began with the intent to test the hypothesis, is beauty subjective? Or is beauty universal, right? So if beauty is something that evolved across all human beings, and thus we should expect it to be a universal feature, we would expect high cross-cultural agreement in faces that are beautiful, right? And that's what we see in this meta-analysis is that there really is kind of high agreement across cultures, even higher than within cultures. Kind of strange. So why is that also? I'll try to explain that in a minute as well. Again, we see pair reliability is lower. Okay, so that's kind of the point of this. Going on to the next slide. Here we have cross-ethnic ratings, right? So someone that's from one ethnic group rating another, or from one racial group rating another. And you see it's a little bit lower, but not that much lower. It's still pretty high at 0.88. Pair reliability also lower, but not extremely low. None of these ratings are extremely low, even if you look at the pairs, which are lower, right? Indicating that there are shared or universal preferences for certain features, certain faces, for beauty and for attractiveness. So looking here, kind of summing up what we can take from this paper by Lingulis and colleagues, okay? This is important going forward for the video. This, I think, is the main point here, is that mean agreements can be misleading. When you look at the mean inter-rater correlation, or I should say the mean rating of a study, and it shows something really, really high, and you think, wow, everyone agrees what an attractive face is. That's not the case. Everyone doesn't agree. There's just a high correlation. The distribution around the mean, boom, it's narrow. So there's a great deal less agreement between two individuals. Why is that? Does that seem strange that you can have more agreement between a larger group of individuals, a higher correlation than you will within two? You would think, given more individuals, there would be more variation, but you can look at the small normal distribution. If you think every little line on that is a different participant, take two of those lines out at random and correlate them. You know, see what happens. One is way over here, one is way over here. And you do that enough and you see, wow, there's actually more variation within a sample than there is across the entire sample. And this is something that's observed in genetics and psychology very, very often, is that there's more variation between individuals than there is variation across the whole group, or than there is variation between groups, that sort of a thing. Another interesting finding from this paper was that there was more agreement on attractiveness for outgroups. So why do you think that is? In this paper, it doesn't say, but I have an idea, okay? Certainly everyone has heard the trope, you know, where someone is from an ethnic or a cultural outgroup and you say, oh, those people, they all look the same to me, right? So this is a real cognitive thing, okay? It's not just like a trope or a racist thing. It's a real cognitive bias that we view faces of our own cultural group, of our own ethnicity, as being more unique, as being more diverse. We're able to recognize them better. And faces that are from outgroups, we do tend to perceive them a little bit more similar. And that might be why there is less variation or more agreement in ratings of faces in outgroup, right? Because, you know, if they all look the same, you say, oh, they all look the same. I have difficult time telling them apart or more. And certainly this might not even be a conscious thing, you know. This is probably not what's going through most people's minds. It's probably something that is happening, a bias that most people are unaware of. So keeping that in mind, it's possible that we cognitively group people in, okay, unattractive, attractive, whereas within our own in-groups, we see more of a gradient. This is just an idea, an interpretation of why that may be. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's a good hypothesis. So also on that, cross-cultural ratings specifically, something to keep in mind is that some research, more recent research, has found the opposite effect. Now, this is comparing specific groups. It's certainly not a very, very large comparison across cultures like the Lingulis meta-analysis, but we do see some disagreement across cultural groups in what faces are attractive in some cases. So an example here from Coetzee and colleagues, cross-cultural agreement in facial attractiveness is the role of ethnicity and gender. So a finding from this, and there was a few others in this paper, but just to give you an example, Scottish and African raters, they agreed on the attractiveness of Scottish faces pretty well. You know, Pearson's R of 0.7, so fairly high correlation. Scottish and African raters, on the other hand, they didn't really agree on the attractiveness of African faces, okay? People from the culture that the African participants were taken from in this study. Much lower correlation of 0.37. So this shows that there is cross-cultural disagreement on faces, and that the culture that you are a part of, as well as the ethnic group that you are a part of, will determine to some extent what faces you find attractive, okay? So beauty is not subjective, but beauty is not 100% universal or biological either. There are environmental factors, there are biological factors, heritability of what you find beautiful, and that sort of a thing. Next slide here. Okay, so similar idea here. Honeycutt in 2006 ran a series of 4 studies looking at inter-judge, right? This is kind of the pair-to-pair agreement in facial attractiveness ratings. You can see here in the chart, these are the faces that were rated, or I should say this is ratings, how far they can vary for an individual face. So you'll see most faces in the study have people who rated them very high, and they have people who rated them very low. If there was much agreement between individuals on what faces were attractive, you would expect those to be more squashed together. This is the highest and the lowest rating. So some of those not shown in the graph would actually be more squashed together. At the same time, this can show you a very good illustration of how much 2 individuals can vary when rating the same face, okay? So there can be a lot of disagreement on the same face. Next slide. Bronsted and colleagues, similar finding, okay? There's an interjudge correlation by about 0.42 in this case. So something else to consider is that it was lower for strangers, quite a bit lower, and much higher for spouses. So what also does that tell us? That when we select faces that are attractive, it's not completely independent of ourselves and who we are. Similarly, when we share perceptions of attractive faces, we share those with people who are closer to us. It's kind of an assortative effect, right? Assortative mating, assortative selection for friends and colleagues, as well as genetic heritability. You can see it in siblings, and there's another sibling study on this that's very good. It showed about 50% genetic contribution to facial attractiveness ratings. I don't have it in this video, but another example to keep in mind when we're talking about facial ratings, right? Because you're usually not rating faces of people that you know, people that you might actually share an aesthetic preference with. It's strangers, okay? We're comparing strangers with one another, and the correlation between them is going to be a little bit lower as well. Another thing to consider, certainly this is discussed often when people talk about the facial rating services, okay? Because most of these facial rating services are online, and they're run by men, aren't they? I think certainly most are that I have seen. And that's, you know, people will say, why would you let a man rate your face? So we should ask, are there sex differences in facial ratings? Do men really rate men's faces differently than women do? Or do they kind of agree? Let's see what the research shows here. So men and women, they do agree, but a little bit less than we would see. Remember, the mean agreement across people in general from Langulis is about 0.9, very, very high. It's lower for men and women. It's about 0.71. So not much lower, but a little bit lower. But men and women do rate faces differently, and the way in which they rate these faces differently is important as well. Going on to the next slide here. For example, men rate masculine faces as more attractive than women do. There's a lot of discourse and debate out there in the realm of discourse about masculinity and attractiveness. If a masculine face is more attractive, if a feminine face is more attractive, who do women like? Do they like the Giga Chad? Do they like Chris Hemsworth? Or do they like a K-pop, very feminine type of face? And certainly there are women that prefer both, right? There are women that prefer one more than the other, that like both at the same time. And so there is actual real variation in that, but on average, men will show stronger, higher ratings for facial attractiveness with masculine faces than women will. Something to consider there. Another study, this was kind of a cool one by Lee and colleagues, a recent one. He let men turn up the masculinity of their own faces. So how do you do that? A great deal of research on facial masculinity and attractiveness uses edited faces, right? You have to, sort of, because it's a confound if you don't. You can't pick a different face that's feminine from an entirely different face that's masculine, because you don't know if femininity or masculinity is the real variable. So what people do is they take a face and then they edit it, computer edit it to make the jaws bigger, to make the brow ridge more pronounced, masculinized face, kind of like a slider in a video game. You've played Skyrim or something like that, and you make your characters and you turn all the sliders up so you have a really strange face. And that's kind of what they let people do. So what men did in this study was they just turned the sliders from masculinity way up, right? They made their faces really masculine, and then when they rated their faces, their own faces, they said, oh yeah, I like that more. That's very attractive. Men wanted to make their own faces look more masculine. Women rated those same faces as less attractive than the men's normal faces. So men will do things, masculinizing preferences, so to speak, that they think are attractive that perhaps women don't. Something to consider there as well. Another finding, men who like other men, right? Gay men, they prefer faces that are more masculine than women do, okay? Which, intuitive, perhaps it is. You have men that really like men, so maybe they like a really, really masculine face. There's a lot of debate within, controversy debate, I should say, within gay communities, about who likes masculine men, who likes more feminine men, do they get along with each other? I don't know a whole lot about that, but an example here of a paper of how individual preferences, sexual preferences, can influence preferences for masculinity as well. So if you get a face rating online and it's by a man, maybe he likes men and you don't know that, and that could influence his ratings of your face as well. Something else to consider there if you have a man rating your face. Men also rate faces as more attractive than women do on average. Male faces, I should say, and female faces for that matter, both. So men are more likely to rate a face as attractive or highly attractive face if you give them a Likert scale, right? This is a study by Nedelik and Beaver in 2011. But some of you might actually be much more familiar with the infamous OkCupid data set, which shows this effect across, the whole collection of OkCupid data from a few years back in the book Dataclysm by Kristen Rudder. So certainly what you saw in that was that men rated women's faces, kind of in a distribution with the midpoint, the 2 or the 5. I think it was a 5-point scale. Well, whatever. They rated most of the people in the middle. Women didn't. Women rated men, to the left mostly. You can see in the chart here, like I said, I think most of you watching this video have probably seen this. Probably this very famous chart you will recognize. So women are not handing out ratings that are very, very attractive. Men are. Something to consider again as far as sex differences go in how women view men versus how men view other men and how men view women when they give out these ratings. A final example here from a little survey that I ran as well. Men and women can give very different average responses on the same face as well. So not looking at just pairs here, but we're looking at the average ratings across a larger sample, not a huge sample, but not small either. So, one face here, all of you will recognize this probably, and you see that the way that women and men rated this face, it's almost the exact opposite of each other, right? Men mostly rated the face attractive. Women mostly rated the face unattractive. Some men rated it unattractive. Some women rated it unattractive. But you basically see the opposite effect by gender. So kind of an example of how faces that men like, right, might not match up very well with what women like. And there's a lot of discourse, there's research within psychology and that sort of thing on how male standards, particularly when you talk about male bodies, are more geared toward what men want to see. If you think about superhero bodies and bodybuilders, women will say, I don't find that attractive. Men, say, that's what I want to look like. Do women really not find that attractive when they self-report that? I mean, that's another question for another video, but certainly, one example of how, at least as far as faces go, men and women can actually indicate very different preferences for the same face. So what should we take home from this here, just to sum up the sex differences, okay? Men and women don't totally disagree on average, right? So if a man can rate your face, it's not gonna, you shouldn't expect it to be totally different from a woman rating your face, okay? But it's probably not gonna be as good as a woman rating your face. There are meaningful differences between the way that men and women rate faces, both as far as the scores that they give you, right? And think about that. If men give high scores and women really do, and you have a man that's trying to rate your face and he's trying to be really objective about it, and he's thinking about it like okay, I'm going to rate this face on how I think it is positioned within the distribution of all men in the population. And this is someone you're paying to rate their face, and they have a code book and a criteria, and they say these features, okay, you are a 5. And then you give it to 10 women and they're like, that's a 2. Does the facial rating help you that much? Is it really giving you an accurate picture of what you wanted the rating for, which for many of you presumably is going to be for self-improvement, for dating or whatever, something to consider there, that, the way that men and women rate faces seems to be pretty different. Going on, okay, we've covered the research. We're going to look at what does this tell us about facial rating services, people that you pay to rate your face, okay? So first, as far as I know, there is no research on paid face raters, right? People that you pay to rate your face. As far as I know, there's no research on paid face raters, people that you would pay to rate your face. I don't think that exists yet. But something to consider is that we can take the limitations that are associated with just one person rating a face, and we can apply those to people who rate your face, who's just one person. There are inherent limitations to having just one person rate your face, which is, the same kind of limitation that you see when you compare pairwise ratings of the face, right? You take a person, he could be anywhere in the distribution. He could be over here. He could be over here. You correlate them, you see a weak correlation. If it's just one person, they can fall anywhere within that distribution. You don't know if the rater is going to be rating you very, very low. You don't know if they're going to really actually be able to rate you close to the mean of what a group of women would rate you as. You don't know if they're going to be rating you really, really high. There's no way to tell. Okay, so a limitation there, and that's an inherent limitation of having just one person, is that you cannot judge from that one rating where the mean distribution will fall. And that's something to consider when you think about inter-rater correlations, because I have seen people say, okay, so the inter-rater correlations of faces are very, very high. That means most people will agree on a facial rating, and that means that if you get someone to rate your face, they're probably going to be close to what a group of women would rate you as. That's not true. That's kind of related to what is called the ecological fallacy, right? Where an individual data point in a distribution usually does not reflect the mean of that distribution very well. Why? Because it can fall anywhere within that distribution. The other thing to consider, okay, is, the sex differences that we covered. As far as I have seen, most of these face raters are men, and they're rating other men. So, and this applies if it's a woman rating another woman, but I'm less familiar with that research. Most of what I have focused on is women rating men. So this is a man rating another man. How generalizable is that to a woman rating a man, or to a group of women rating a man? We have to question, the generalizability there. Perhaps, it's okay, but, we don't really know the extent to which it will even reflect the way a woman goes about rating a face. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll cover this here because I think this applies to individuals who rate faces for money, okay? A trained rater may actually approximate actual group ratings pretty well. And in research, as I explained at the beginning, what people will do is they will get a code book sometimes, or they will get a set of criteria and they'll say, okay, rate this face according to this criteria. Things like symmetry, is the skin smooth? And they can go down this checklist, and certainly I've seen facial ratings of men online where they say they look at the tilt of the eyes, they look at the width of the jaw, and the width of the nose. So you can go down these criteria. And when you have these trained raters that do this, you can have smaller groups of raters, and sometimes they can approximate large groups of natural raters pretty well, like when you just ask a group of people, hey, rate this face. Because, of course, there are features, objectively, proportions, symmetry, those sorts of things that do predict ratings of facial attractiveness. So if you are able to isolate those and identify them, you can kind of, get an idea of what faces most people are going to find attractive and what aren't. I mentioned the algorithms, the artificial intelligence, machine learning, that sort of a thing. Same way, it's just taking, a bunch of different features of the face, and it's creating, an algorithm from those and determining, this is what's going to be attractive. And they can, this one algorithm can predict what groups of people will, on average, rate as attractive. So something to consider is, even in research, when there's trained face raters, it's usually still not one person. Usually it'll be a few people. I've seen as little as 2 people. I don't think I've ever just seen like one person rates the face. Because even if you have 2 people and you have a code book, say you have, I explained what the code book was, a list of features that you're looking for objectively, like is the face symmetrical? You have 2 people, they're working from the same code book. You still have to try and correlate those 2 people's ratings together to see if they're following the code book accurately. If you have just one person, you have no idea if the ratings are going to be following that code book, if they're going to, where it's going to fall in the distribution. If there is agreement, someone else could follow the same method and get a wildly different result, in which case you would have to wonder, is the person doing it right? Is the code book just unclear? That sort of a thing. So there's always that limitation when it's just one guy rating your face. Okay, let's see. Something else to consider in the favor of individual ratings of facial attractiveness. There is, a whole practice of medicine, of dentistry, of orthodontics, that basically has one guy fixing your face, right? If a single person couldn't look at your face and say, this is what's unattractive about it, we're going to apply these criteria and we're going to make it more attractive, things like plastic surgery wouldn't exist, right? Things like orthodontics wouldn't exist. If you go into the literature of these fields, they talk a lot about proportions in an objective sense, and when they do operations, they do a lot of those based on proportions. So you have trained experts, people who are trained in facial proportions, in what is aesthetic, and they're able to modify the face to make it more attractive. And, about plastic surgery, people say, oh, it looks so bad afterwards. I don't think it does, guys. And I'll tell you why. We see the botched surgeries. We see the people that have had 30 surgeries and they look like Barbie, they look like plastic. You don't see the vast industry of cosmetic surgery that do subtle changes that really improve someone's features that are completely undetectable. You don't see them because they're invisible. It's that simple. So we have examples, practical examples where one guy can say, okay, I know what will make your face more attractive, and they go in with the knife and they do it. So we can't discount, that people can look at your face, a single person, and kind of give you an accurate idea of, maybe, this part isn't good, this part is good, and kind of give you a rating on that. Some final thoughts here. Quicker video today, okay? One thing that I want you all to take home from this is that mean agreements on facial attractiveness is pretty high, okay? Strong evidence for shared beauty standards across the world, strong evidence for universal beauty standards across the world, even when there are exceptions, right? The exceptions don't totally disprove it. But that level of agreement can be misleading when you try to apply it to individuals, because there's actually high individual variation in which faces are attractive. So if you have that mean distribution of a face, you take an individual, well, maybe the individual is here, maybe the individual is there. And you can see that when you look at the paired correlations, you can see that if you pluck an individual out from the distribution. Are the face raters worth it when you pay them money? Are they going to tell you something that's worthwhile or accurate? Who knows? It's impossible to know if it's just one person. There's no way to compare that to anything else. Ideally, what I would recommend is that you get a group of women to rate you. And, that's easier said than done. Perhaps, you're going to go out on the street and start asking women like, hey, rate my face. You could. There are apps, that do this, where you can put your picture up and then a bunch of women will rate it. I think Photo Feeler is one, for example. And you can get kind of a collective rating of women. I think probably that's going to be better than any individual rating your face, especially since it is women, and especially since on those apps, a lot of those women are on there because they're also in the dating environment. So you're actually having people rate your face that are probably also on an app like Tinder or Bumble or something. So kind of a similar demographic, which is also perhaps more important for generalizable generalizability, something that you don't have if, you know, a random influencer online who is a man is rating your face. At the same time, you know, someone who is trained to rate faces, they might do okay. I would be cautious with anyone saying, you know, I've rated 1,000 faces, so I'm really good at rating faces, because they might have, you know, rated 1,000 faces poorly. They might be repeating biases or mistakes or errors over and over and over. There's no way to know when it's just one person. So caution with the individual face raters. No way to tell how accurate those are going to be. Some reasons to suspect, you know, that it's probably not going to be as good as a group of people rating your face. And anyway, I hope you guys liked the video. Merry Christmas, everybody. I will make another for you very soon.